Gators Breakdown episode 60 is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And my co-host for this episode, Bill Sykes. You can find Bill on Twitter at RealBSykes. Joey won't be joining us tonight as this podcast off. So, Bill, how's it been, man?
Man, it's been good. It's been a long day, so I'm ready to settle in, talk some football, and have a good time tonight.
That's right. We got a really special guest for you guys tonight. Our friends over at 24/7 and GatorBait.net had a bit of a big announcement last week as they brought over Blake Alderman to bolster their already great recruiting coverage, and now he'll join us here on this episode of Gators Breakdown. Thomas Goldcamp, Marty Cohen, and Luke Stampini already made GatorBait the premier website for Gators news and analysis. Bill and I have been members there for years. But now it's been made even better with the addition of Blake, as he's already killed it with his coverage in the last week or so. So, Blake, congrats on joining 24/7, and thanks for joining us here on Gators Breakdown.
Thanks, I appreciate that. You just really kind of built me up now, so now I have to really put out some good content. You built me up. Now I'm like a roller coaster.
Yeah, you said you're going to give us the next 10 commitments, right?
Yeah, I'm going to give them to you in order. I'm going to give you their shoe size, their favorite food, and probably, a couple other things. Who knows?
Hey, our listeners have high standards around here, so I think you'll fit in fine.
Good. I think I can handle that.
All right. Before we get started, remember you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Just search on those sites or get the links by following us on Twitter at Gators Breakdown, and on Facebook, just search Gators Breakdown. Also, please share the show if you like it, leave a review, and rate on iTunes. And Blake, where can they find you on Twitter?
At Blake_Alderman. I used to it now. My Twitter used to be at Mr. Alderman, and I had to give it a change and clean it up a little bit. So it's at Blake_ALDERMAN.
All right, Blake, we'll just really dive into this recruiting part of no matter if it's on the field or off the field, the quarterback position dominates talk, and until Florida finds one, it's front and center of every conversation, either recruiting on the or football on the field itself. This 2018 class looked to be pretty eventful so far, and what's happening behind the scenes for the Gators chasing a quarterback. It looked like they could have had Artur Sitkowski locked up, but the staff decided to move on. Didn't look like Florida was moving in a different direction with the style of quarterback the coaches wanted, and we all saw the offers that were being thrown around to the likes of Justin Fields, Emory Jones, Jaron Williams, Joe Milton, with Fields being the number one target, it seems. Florida's still trying to lure him away from his commitment to Penn State, even if it could cost him a chance maybe at landing Milton or Williams. And Williams decommitted from Kentucky earlier today, this Monday. So kind of seems to be a high-risk, high-reward move here by the coaches if we're reading the tea leaves correct. Blake, can you shed light on the situation from what you're hearing and can gather about this ever-evolving quarterback situation?
Sure. I think, like you said, the big name to watch is Justin Fields, the 5-star quarterback out of Georgia. I talked to him recently. Last week it was one of my first stories with 24/7. Still 100% solid to Penn State. He's saying all the right things there, but he's still talking with a couple schools, and I think Florida would probably be sitting in like a second place right now. Georgia, Auburn, Florida State, those are other schools that are also in this too that are pushing for him. But, Florida's really going all out. When I talked to him, it was, it wasn't just one coach from Florida. It wasn't, a couple. It's the whole staff. He hears from the whole staff. He has some kind of relationship with at least every member of the staff. And, just that style of recruiting, you can definitely tell that, that's obviously their top guy. Jaron Williams, another one that you mentioned, just decommitted from Kentucky. Florida's also a pretty big player in there as well. Alabama, Florida State, Ole Miss, LSU are a couple other schools that I've heard mentioned. He's obviously just backed off, so there's still a lot of moving parts there. But, I would say I feel comfortable saying that those are the ones to watch. Was really interested in Florida even before his Kentucky commitment, so, I think Florida would factor high on that list. He definitely can fit a lot of the things that they want to do. So, I think that, he's definitely a guy on there. Joe Milton is one that is mentioned. Florida is a finalist. I actually was at his high school today. It seems like he's going to make a decision maybe someday this week. If not, I would say the latest is what he said was, the first of next week. I don't feel like Florida is really a major player there. I don't feel like they're pushing very hard. I think that they're in contact with him at least a couple, times a week. So, that they're recruiting him, but I think that they want to continue to evaluate and see a little bit more of him, see how he can read a defense, see how he is, not in shirts and shorts at some, camp or something like that. I think that's the big thing with him. And it just, for Florida, he wants to decide earlier than maybe they have done their homework on him enough. This, as far as not necessarily not doing their homework, but just feeling comfortable with what he can do on the field. So, I think that's, if I had to make a pick probably right now, I think Michigan is probably the smarter pick right now, just if he makes a decision this early. And another guy that Florida's going to see this week is Chase Wolf. He's a quarterback out of Ohio. Doug Nussmeier will be by his high school on Tuesday to see him throw. No offer at this time, but he's just a new name I guess you could just keep an eye on as we go forward here. It's definitely going to be an interesting race. I always like to say there's always a stage in recruiting. There's always like a different season for it. And until you get your quarterback commit, it's always who's going to be the QB season.
Right. And with Fields, what I think would help him the most, if he plans on flipping it, say, if his mind's made up right now, we don't really know right now if his mind's made up or not. But if he's going to flip, it would benefit him, I think, to go ahead, announce it, get some momentum going for this class, because in a way it helps him. It helps him recruit, other targets to bring along with Florida. I think the if you follow Twitter and all the follows, the big popular thing is follow the follows.
Sure.
There's a big conglomerate of recruits there that, 4 or 5 guys there that kind of all follow each other and kind of all point to each other. So I really think if Fields is going to do it, it would help the Gators and help him go ahead and make that decision.
Sure. When you're a quarterback, it's just like Jake Allen. He committed early because he wanted to recruit. He wanted to get guys in the class with him. He just wanted to build those relationships. So, it does help to get it on board the earliest, but, it also, it's hard whenever you have to flip a guy. If you press a guy for a flip too hard, you could mess things up there. So, I think Florida has to be careful, and I think that's what they're doing. They're obviously making him feel like a priority. They're urging him to get on campus. It's kind of a family decision with Fields. His mom is from the Pennsylvania area, has family in that area. So, she's sold on Penn State. That's where they want to be. The dad is obviously telling him, is what Justin told me, that the dad is saying, don't burn these bridges with other schools. You never know what happens. Coaches can go certain places. Penn State could lose, a bunch of games this season. You never know in college football. It's a weird industry. So, I think that they're keeping their options open, but as far as when or whatever, I think Florida needs to get the entire family on board, because there are ties to Penn State, and you do have to overcome those for sure.
Hey, Blake, kind of to springboard off this quarterback discussion, especially with recruiting, Florida is extremely optimistic right now, at least as much as they have been since Greer left, about the quarterback position, with Franks looking good in the spring game, him being a high-profile recruit. They feel like they've got some separation on the depth chart now. If he comes out and has a big season this year, whether he throws for 2,500 or 3,000 yards, or just has a good touchdown to interception ratio, leads a functional offense, whatever it may look like, if we see definitive progress and him grasping a foothold on that position for the next few years, how does that affect the quarterback position as far as recruiting is concerned? How does that affect a primo guy like Justin Fields that probably has his eye on starting as a freshman, at whatever school he goes to? How do you think that impacts things?
It's kind of hard to tell, because there's competition at every school you go to, and I think a lot of kids know that, and a lot of coaches say that, that there's going to be competition in any school you go to. I think a guy like Justin Fields, he's a very confident kid. He's very confident in what he can do. He's very confident because Florida seems to be, and you guys mentioned it before, they seem to be going to the direction of a quarterback that's a little bit more mobile, and I think when he has that attribute that he can bring to that offense, I think it will get him in the mix early. Whether, let's say Franks come out and lights it up, Justin can be that solid number 2 guy. And, the last couple of years, it's been tough for Florida to make it through a season with just one quarterback. So, I think the things that you can mention to a kid, and I think that it's something that he needs to do his homework for. And I think it's not necessarily what Franks will do, it's how they want to use him, is the offense or their coaching making him successful? Because a lot of people knew that Franks was pretty raw coming in. So, I think there are ways that you can flip that to some positives there, and so, I think that, sure, if you have a guy and other schools can use that for negative recruiting, but I think that if Justin is as close as he says he is with the coaches at Florida, I think that that can be flipped into, into a positive, just like kind of like what I just did.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's a lot of people who have pointed to the fact that, Florida will sell itself once the offense becomes functional again. And it's been such an easy tool in the hand of other schools to negative recruit against the Gators, saying, oh, their offense isn't moving. Well, if Franks comes out in year 3 and has a successful season, if that position is functional, well, suddenly you look at Jim McElwain's trajectory there, and it's like, oh, okay, wait a minute. This guy is turning things around. This guy is fixing things. And I think that could ignite a spark amongst the recruits that says, hey, wait, Florida's on the way back. I mean, would you agree or disagree there?
Sure. I think the thing, at least the last couple of years in Florida, is that, it seems like the end of the season, they slip some. They usually, that's if Florida, if you want to bet on at least the last couple of years, when will Florida lose some games? The last couple of years shows that, the last few games they kind of drop some off, Alabama, FSU, the last couple of years. And that does hurt you when it comes time for recruiting season. I always think recruiting season is December, January, the time when you're at the Under Armour game, and that's whenever schools start to really negative recruit you. If their offense continues to build up, it seems like, they are, like you said, just that, that one big offensive season or that one big quarterback play away from, really turning the table. And I think that will start to get a lot of eyes. You beat Florida State, that little things like that can put you over the hump in state. And I think that all these things lead towards recruiting. And if Florida takes care of business, the sky's really the limit, especially with 2019, the class, how it's going so far, number one in the state, or number one in the 24/7 rankings there. 2019 could be a really big year if they really build off of this season.
Maybe we should call it number one in the world, because it's not like Mexico has a better recruiting class. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So nationally, best class in the entire world.
That's right.
There we go.
Milky Way.
So we posted the question over the weekend. I posed a question to Gator fans. All right, Gators, if you could choose one QB recruit to sign, who would it be? And out of 655 votes, Justin Fields, 60%, thought if they could choose a quarterback, Justin Fields would be the guy. No surprise there. But Joe Milton, 30%. 30% of the fans wanted him.
He's the popular guy on the timeline.
He really is. A lot of people really think he can grow into something. I'd be kind of interested to know if they expect something to happen right away, or if they would agree he's more of a project and can end up being pretty good. Emory Jones, 5%, and other 5%. So you could probably throw Jaron Williams in that. But then I also follow that up with, to follow that last poll, which QB do you think the Gators will sign for 2016? Numbers changed a good bit. Field with 44%, Milton with 34%, Jones with 2%, and other with 20%. And I'm sure all the Jaron Williams news today kind of threw in where people would vote in other on that. So, Justin Fields, Emory Jones, Jaron Williams, Joe Milton, those seem to be the top 4. You mentioned the Wolf guy they're visiting tomorrow, but, it seems like Florida will get their next quarterback probably out of those group of guys.
Sure. I think that's safe to say, especially, with Wolf, no offer, really only like a week and a half that he's been hearing from Florida. So, I don't think he's one that I would put on that list. But sure, I think it certainly looks like one of those guys. I think if I had to pick my own, just to throw my own pick in there, I think Jaron Williams is probably the safest pick right now. Obviously, decommitting from a school, opening things back up. Florida was a big player before he committed to Kentucky, just didn't have the offer. He's talking with the staff pretty consistently. I think last time I talked to him, he says he hears from Nussmeier and McElwain both at least once or twice a week. So, Florida's obviously, in this mix here for him. I was actually heard that Nussmeier is going to get in touch with Williams tonight just to talk to him again now that he's opened things back up, and just sit down and have another conversation with him, obviously, to kind of see where maybe he's leaning or where his head's at. So I think that's probably the one that I'm most comfortable with. But I do think that Florida has a legitimate shot in Fields. I just think there's a lot of what ifs right now to where I can't sit here and say for sure that this is going to happen. But I do think, like I said, that there's legit interest. I think that if Florida can get him on campus and kind of talk to the whole family, kind of sell them, show everybody everything, I think it can start to get interesting, because it does seem that Fields isn't quite, shut the door on his recruitment. I know he was just up at Penn State last weekend, so obviously that makes it tougher because, just gets him back on campus again. But, if he starts taking visits in the summer, I definitely think that, that's one to watch. I don't see him taking visits in the spring, just with he's playing baseball, he's got spring football, he's just got a lot going on. So I think if anything, as far as visits happen with Justin Fields, I think it would probably be in the summer. I
mentioned this being a risk reward here. If they don't get Fields and these other guys are committed elsewhere, I think a lot of people were saying this, you would see the timeline, you would see the message boards in meltdown mode if Florida doesn't get probably somebody out of that group. And I think what could happen, the scenario would be not getting Fields. He decides to stay at Penn State, but it has been too late to get these other guys that they committed elsewhere as well. But I think if Felipe Franks comes out this fall and lights it up, I think that will kind of, maybe soften the blow if you don't get one of these guys.
Sure. I think that's the thing too. Everyone. I think the thing with Florida fans is, it's just been so long without, the quarterback play that they're used to. So, everyone's favorite player is the backup. Everyone's, always thinks, that's the next best thing. So, I do think that can soften the blow a little bit. But, I also think too that if Florida fans get Justin Fields, I think that would really, as far as you say, is melting down the boards. Like that would be the first big time quarterback like that. So I definitely think that it's interesting. I'm hoping from a business standpoint that we can get that traffic from Justin Fields coming on board, but it's all kind of still up in the air. That's the fun thing. Everyone asks me, what's going on with the quarterback board? Where's everything leaning? And I can just kind of give an outline right now that I'm still waiting to see how it fills in. So I'm interested to see how things play out too.
Hey, I forgot to mention the question I asked you earlier about Franks having a big season, how that would impact things. That was an excellent question from one of our listeners named Nathan Crouch. He's at Nathan Crouch 07. Nathan, thanks so much for your question, man. And speaking of getting somebody to jump in, and jump into this class and be that, lightning rod recruit, another one of our listeners, Gator Ed at Double O Ed, asked, who's going to be the next commit? I mean, there's not a whole lot of them for this 2018 class. Who do you see as a guy or two that might be the next to break the ice some more?
If I had to throw a couple out there, I think Amari Burney is one that I was looking at. June 1st commitment. He's kind of got that locked in. It was his grandfather's birthday between Florida and Ohio State. I feel very confident that Florida is going to be the pick there. He's just visited a lot, in-state kid. Florida's telling him that he can play offense or deep. They're recruiting him as an athlete. I think he's a little bit better as a safety, could grow into a linebacker maybe. But I think that he's probably the most likely one. Another one that I think there's been some buzz that maybe the wide receiver Anthony Schwartz could want to move up his timeline a little bit here. He's talked about I think the more solid thing that he's looked at now is maybe committing sometime in the opening, but there's been some talk of him maybe moving things up. He's been between Florida and Miami for like the whole recruitment as far as, top schools there. And, there's been, like I said, there's been some buzz of him wanting to move things up and get out of the way. And I do think if he did move things up, I think Florida's the pick.
Cool, man. It's funny you mentioned that about Amari Burney. I don't know if you saw me mention that about the possibility of him playing linebacker on the boards the other day, but he's a guy that fits that profile of what Shannon likes, especially maybe in that Sam linebacker position. I think he's, being recruited at a lot of schools as a safety, but he's like 6'1", 215. He's very athletic. Shannon with a 4-3 needs a guy that can stand in there on every down and play what would have been a nickelback in previous regime schemes. And if that guy can get up to that 225 range and keep his athleticism, he might be a really big weapon for Florida on that defense at that position.
Sure. He's definitely the athletic guy. He can move around and make a lot of plays. I think safety is where, from what seeing him on both sides, I've seen him where, usually when he camps, he works out on both sides of the ball, and he's just a really athletic, guy. And the way he keeps growing, I think that he reminds me a lot of Kylan Johnson. He has that, the kind of like that. He came in as a safety, really athletic, was more of a quarterback in high school, just really athletic kid. But, I think that Amari comes in a little bit more groomed as far as, he's played some safety in school. So, I think that he could be a big player in Shannon's defense, just like you said. It's been my thoughts of him the whole time. It's just, and I always keep asking me, how big are you going to get, man?
And he's another one too. I believe you said Ohio State's involved there, right?
Yeah, it's really a finalist of Ohio State and Florida. Virginia Tech was his last visit, but really just seems like a two-team race there.
Yeah, I'm ready to put the ex-coach on out of the family there and put up some healthy boundaries. I think he needs to mind his own business. We need these Florida kids to stay home.
Yeah, no doubt. It's actually Greg Schiano, too, that's been pushing him, too. And I made the joke to him, too, and I was like, man, didn't that guy do enough damage to my Bucks? Like, he wants to take the guy. He laughed. He thought it was great. But, that's been the thing with them is it really seemed pretty close coming off that Ohio State visit. He has them pushing for him. But, just from talking to him, it just sounds like with Florida just, this is another kid that McElwain's been on from, very early. He talks to just about every coach on the staff. So, I think that that's a kid that, they continue to make a priority. And I feel really comfortable with, I actually crystal balled him to Florida, so I feel very comfortable with that pick.
Nice. And let's see. I believe Amari Burney is not only a 4-star, but he's a top 200 kid, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, I've got it right here. He's actually listed as a 94 grade on the composite, 4 stars, actually the 106th of the nation. And, Florida has had a hard time landing some of those top 100, top 150, top 200 kids. Number 11 safety, 25th in the state. That would be another one that would really be a statement to me. That's the kind of kids that Florida needs to be bringing in right now.
Sure. Just like last year, I think it was Florida led all the in-state schools of, the ones that getting the kids in state. I think that they're continue to build off of that.
Blake, with the recent commits, I think we've heard and seen the name Juwan Sider and Corey Bell a lot, but we'll throw in Brad Davis as well since he's one of the new guys on the staff. What's the reputation of these new coaches been on the trail?
It's been pretty good. It's been great. Brad Davis actually. I live in Lakeland, here in the central part of Florida, and that's where he recruits and stuff. And he hasn't made it around to a lot of schools yet, just because the spring evaluation period just started. So he'll be out soon. But there's a lot of kids in this area that have said that they talked to Coach Davis. He's been the one that's probably gotten. He's gotten probably the most buzz. It seems like all the offensive line kids really like him. William Barnes, John Campbell, Nick Petit-Frere, all these guys, they really seem to love Coach Davis. And, I said on another interview that I did that it's really no slight to Coach Summers, but I just don't think that he could have gotten the buzz with these kids. And, especially whenever you have a class like this in Florida where offensive line is, this is the best offensive line class in state I've seen in a long time. So, it definitely was the kind of year if you wanted to, land a lot of these top kids, he's doing some work there. Juwan Sider's doing a lot of good things down in South Florida, down in Palm Beach County. The 5'6", he tweeted about that today that he'll be out there recruiting. Actually, be there on Tuesday. So, he's been doing good. He's gotten a lot of kids. Iverson Clement to jump on board. This is a kid that had visited Florida a lot of times in the past and, just really never was mentioning him like that until Coach Sider was there, and they actually got a commitment from him recently. Asa Martin, another kid. It just seems like whenever Coach Sider was first brought into Florida, the running back board was such a question mark. And now that, it's stocked pretty solid. And, he's gotten a lot of guys down there in South Florida. And the staff continues to build, those relationships and hit that hard with just the hires they've made. And, Coach Bell's another one that, knows a lot of guys down there in South Florida. He has a lot of ties just like Coach Shannon. And, I think that, you're going to see a lot of kids from South Florida, even more so, continue to head up to Gainesville with just that staff they've got down there. Those guys recruit really well down there. And they know, like I said, a ton of people.
Blake, it's interesting you mentioned this offensive line group. And one of the things you always hear as a Florida fan and a state of Florida football fan, as far as someone who follows recruiting, is that offensive linemen just don't grow on trees down here. You get your speed talent here, you go to Wisconsin or wherever for your offensive linemen. But this year it's loaded in state and still on the board right now. You got so many big timers between Barnes and Campbell, Garage, Petit-Frere, and Dunlap, even without Reed, who committed to Miami. How big do you think this class is going to be slot-wise, and how many of those do you think that the staff dedicates to offensive line with such a big group? Do they go to 5 this year?
I think they can. It depends on which guys went in, obviously, and, with it just being such a loaded area in there, I don't think that they get quite to 5. I don't think that they hit that mark, but, I think 4 is a really safe number. It's obviously really loaded. If I think it could get to 5. It just depends on who and when in the cycle, how long a guy wants to wait out or something. But, I definitely feel very good about Florida's chances with, William Barnes. I feel very good about their chances with Richard Garage, the guy out of Tampa. That's another one that is very close to Coach Davis, too, that I didn't mention before. Nick Petit-Frere, he's an interesting one because he seems very open. Florida is probably gotten him on campus the most just because they're closest. Notre Dame is very much a player. I believe he was just at Alabama this past week, and I know he was on their visitor list. I'm not completely sure if he actually made it up there, but he has a lot of offers. John Campbell's another interesting one too because I know that Florida really likes him. They really like his size. I think that he could use some help as far as technique-wise, but, that's something that could easily – those coaches get paid the big bucks to teach technique. So, that's something they can work on. Florida and Miami, I feel like, are obviously the big two players there. He says he's not going to commit until the fall, but I feel like Miami might have a little bit of an edge just because he's visited there so much. So, it's interesting to see how this O-line class plays out just because, there's so many guys that you can't say no to if they want on board.
Sure. And hey, real quick, if I may interject a little recruiting fan pro tip here, I really like where you went with that. You mentioned how hard it is, even when you see a big swollen board with a lot of talented prospects, even in your home state, how it's hard to land that full group. And if I could just kind of reference back to 2006 when Urban Meyer was taking the state by storm, taking the country by storm, putting together a very good recruiting class, halfway through the cycle, those of us who followed recruiting back then were really excited because we were like, hey, we're going to end up with Percy Harvin and Vidal Hazelton, and we're going to have Jameer Holland from Woodland Hills, California, Damian Williams from Springdale, Arkansas, who played under Malzahn as a high school coach, Chris Bell, who ended up at Penn State. It just doesn't work that way. When you get one or two of these big timers on board, it kind of chases off those other ones who want to be in the limelight. And so at any position, don't ever count on loading up every single spot with premier talent. It's just hard to do.
Sure. I always like to say it's how bad you need a position is how wide you need to cast your net, because guys take this guy's spot. It's like a crazy crossword puzzle, like all the options that they have to do, like on a board. It's really and it gets to a point where you either have a pecking order or it's first come first serve, and it's just how it is.
Blake, while we're right there, I had a question asked right here on a YouTube chat. Do we have any shot of flipping Cleveland Reed, seeing the Gators had the lead for a while?
I don't. I think if Florida's chances are as good as they want to make them, I know that Florida had offered and has been after him. He's visited a couple times, but I don't know where he fit into the big picture of on their offensive line board with just all these other guys that they have on there. It seems like he's the one that maybe needs a little bit more work than, William Barnes, Richard Garage, all these other guys there. So I don't know how hard Florida really was pushing for him, but obviously he was a target on the board. I think that if Florida misses on some of these guys, maybe they kind of circle the wagon and, he can, show some interest there. He's very close to Gainesville, so, he can get there for, any chance of time. He was there a lot for the last season. So, I think that Florida's chances are what they want to make them there.
Okay, that was asked by Ralph Maz there on our YouTube. Going on, Blake Alderman joining us here on Gators Breakdown. Blake, after a bit of a slow start for this 2018 cycle, the Florida received 4 commits 3 or 4 weeks ago from 4-star C.J. Smith and Iverson Clement, 3 stars Corey Gamage and Jalen Goss. Brings Florida up to 6 commits for the 2018 class. I'm going to ask you to make a bit of a prediction here. Will this be another class where the Gators are sprinting to the finish line, or can they start locking up some more players and have a pretty uneventful signing day?
I think that in a perfect world, I think they would like to get everything in the mix early. But, there's so many guys now that want to make their decisions. Under Armour game, Army game, signing day, things like that. So, I think to an extent you're going to have some, sprint to the finish. I don't think it's going to be quite as much of a sprint as it was last cycle. I think that Florida's going to possibly is likely to hold on to quite a few of these coaches on their staff. So, I think that kind of takes away from the crazy finish that they had there. It also kind of depends on how they finish the season, because that always helps you when it gets time for the recruiting season, just because, that's whenever kids start to look and see, where did the team finish here? Where do they finish, as far as, how far they go in the season, how did the offense look and all that. I think it's going to be a little bit less of, as a craze as last cycle. But, I do think that there's always those couple of kids those big fish that want to wait until the end of the cycle. So I think that fans are going to have to wait on a couple for sure. But I just don't think it's going to be to where you see Florida go from 30 to 11 and, in a matter of a couple of days. I don't think it's going to be quite that kind of situation.
All right, well, here's a follow-up question to that. Kind of in addition to the timing, what about results? I've got a poll that I put out to my Twitter followers here, and I'm going to reveal the results after I get your opinion. But I asked them, I said, where do you expect this class to finish in 2018? I mean, remember, McElwain started off in 2015 with the 21st class nationally. Then it was the 12th in 2016, and then squeaked into the top 10 this past year. Do you think it's a national top 5 finish? Is that possible? Is it in the 6 to 10 range again? Or is it outside the top 10 in your opinion?
I think 6 to 10. It depends on who they get. I mean, if you land a Justin Fields, obviously that's going to boost your class up high. I think 6 to 10 is probably more of a something where I feel probably more comfortable with now. Just, there's a lot of talented guys in state on the O-line. I mean, you land a William Barnes, you land Richard Garage, you throw in a Jacob Copeland, like that's going to be, that's going to push your class up there pretty high. And, I don't think Florida's going to take a very, I don't think they're going to take a full class. I think maybe like, low 20s, something like that is probably what you're looking at. So, I think that could put them somewhere in that 10 range, somewhere around there. I think that's probably what I would look at. Top 5, I would say probably not, but I think that 6 to 10 is probably around where I would throw it.
Well, it's interesting you say that because 70% of those who responded are expecting a 6 to 10 finish, and that was about 150 different responders. 17% said national top 5 class, and only 13% is expected outside the top 10. But here's what I did. I went to the 24/7 Sports class calculator, which if you're a nerd like me, I highly recommend it. You can kind of plug and play the different recruits to estimate where the class is going to finish on a score basis.
Bill can spend hours there.
I'm not saying that's happened.
Yes.
I'm just saying I've spent a little quality time with it. We're well acquainted. But what I did is I took the commits that are currently on board for the class, didn't take any of those out. I added Justin Fields. I added Jacob Copeland and Anthony Schwartz, Asa Martin at running back. The offensive line class, pretty much what we talked about. A defensive lineman like Judge Culpepper, Malcolm Lamar, Amari Burney at linebacker, and Josh Jobe is a surprise flip from Miami. Maybe they'll get lucky there. And I did add Tyreek Johnson. It was kind of a best case scenario class. If everything just goes swimmingly and they get a couple of flips and land a couple of 5 stars for the first time in a few years.
That's not you, Bill. That's not you.
Hey, it can happen. I'm all for it. It hasn't happened the last couple of years, but it could happen. But the score that I came up with was a 283.39. If everything goes perfectly, that class between 2013 and 2017 would have been good for 6th, 5th, and 8th. So absolute best case scenario, barring a monumental landslide that we just don't really have reason to expect at this point, the ceiling is probably number 5. This probably isn't going to happen. It just never works out that way. You get the summer swell when your hopes start to rise, and then a week before signing day, you feel like you're getting everybody. But in reality, it just doesn't work that way for any team. So realistically, I kind of see it the same way. If all goes pretty well, bottom of the top 10 is probably where fans can expect them to be.
Sure, I agree with that.
Blake, a pretty popular topic that got released last week by the NCAA. How does this early signing period affect these Florida coaches when it all comes about? Does their outlook or strategy change based on what of these coaches?
I don't think so. This staff is always kind of put early enrollees or early signees kind of at the top of their list. Usually if a kid visits in the season, it's because he's an early enrollee. That's kind of always been their thing. Even McElwain's first real class, he took such heavy early enrollees. So, I don't think it's going to change a lot of their strategy, but I think you're going to start seeing more kids that do want to sign early. A lot of kids, if they can, they do. Sometimes, they think about, I want to live my high school career out. But that's kind of you have so many like IMG academies and, all these kids that transfer around now and go to these kind of schools. So, I think that it's kind of moving up to where kids, treat this thing more of as a business decision. They want to try to get in there and they want to get those reps early. Every kid wants to play early. A lot of kids do play early now just because, it's almost like a vicious circle here where you have guys, that they leave early in the NFL, they leave early, get to college. So, I think that you're going to see a lot more kids do that. And I think to an extent the strategy will stay the same just because that's kind of something they've looked for those kids to expect in there early. But, overall, I think you have to recruit a different guy differently. If you have a guy that is wanting in early, he's going to have to get his spot, and you can't string along and say, well, I think a pecking order, so to say, whenever you have, I think those start to get a little bit more, there's not so much of a time frame on them. Kids have to start giving an answer sooner, because you can't really wait out, especially if you have a guy who's going to be signing in there early. You can't promise a kid a certain spot. So, I think it'll change certain things, but overall, I don't think it's going to be a drastic difference to where everyone's like, man, this is so different. What's going on? Like, I don't think it's going to be anything like that. Sure.
Blake, what about your key or keys to success for this 2018 class? What does Florida need to get done this year in recruiting?
Capitalize on the offensive line, because this is, like you said, I mean, it's not a once in a lifetime kind of offensive class in state, but it's not something that happens a lot. I think that they need to finally get over the hump and get that elite quarterback. And I think that they need to look into continuing to build on the defense. I think that last cycle they started to add some pieces. They have some young guys that are starting to kind of get some play that McElwain's recruited, but they need to continue to add elite defense, elite defenders, guys that have been on their way out, the 5 stars, the top 100 guys, and, in the defensive backfield and the linebacker spot, D-line. I think they need to continue to add elite guys on defense, get a top end quarterback, and capitalize on the O-line class in state.
Nice. And I love that you said that, because I also put that question out to our Twitter followers. And it's an interesting setting, because like Hogan Barris, it's at Hogan Barris 51, says end a few recruitments quick, gain momentum, and have them recruit other players. And he mentions Garage and Barnes and some of those offensive linemen. And, at Pigskin Gator says, give us 2 big-time defensive tackles and 2 big-time linebackers. So they're obviously thinking the same way you are. And then one other one, let's see, Micah Bowden says, hey, the right thing to do is to swing for the fences with the quarterback. So I think the same things we're all talking about. Yeah. Hey, go upgrade that quarterback position, bring those elite defenders in that are going to run and strike and beef up that offensive line. It sounds like we're all on the same page there. But if it's okay with you guys, I wanted to kind of give my little sermon on my keys to this class. Is that cool?
Preach.
Okay. I've been putting some thought into this, and it's really easy to say, well, hey, we need to get a top 5 class. And to me, that's not that simple. But there's 3 little interwoven things here, and I'll make this quick and simple. And Jim McElwain, I know we can discuss this further later. I know you're on it. Number one, they got
at lunch later when you guys go golfing next or something.
Oh, he's in the next room. He's mixing us up some drinks.
He's going to the camera.
With a peanut butter and jelly.
We've got to do some whiteboard stuff with some playbooks. It's boring. Yeah. Anyway, number one thing they got to do, they got to bring elite talent land a 5-star this year. And I know that seems a little arbitrary. I know we've talked about some of the things going on with some of these 5 stars, but they haven't landed one in 2015. And that's not only a talent deficiency, because those guys simply do pan out at a higher rate than the 3s and 4s. It just is a fact, okay? But it's also a notoriety issue, because like you said, there's groups of these players that follow these 5 stars. It has a synergistic effect. When you land one of those guys, it helps you land other players that are talented because they follow each other. They have a herd mentality. But also, the 2018 roster could be without one if CeCe Jefferson and Ivy leave and you don't land one. And I bet that's the first time in the history of Florida football, and that's just not acceptable. And the third thing is the rivals have landed a combined 11. That's Florida State, Georgia, and Tennessee. They've landed 11 since Florida landed their last one. That's got to change. The elite talent needs to be back in Gainesville. The second thing that I think McElwain needs to do is start winning battles versus the top programs. Right now, in the 2018 class, these programs like Alabama and Florida State and Miami are still coming in and having their way, and Florida hasn't stepped up to the plate to battle them toe-to-toe and won. Even the better players in the class from 2017, like James Robinson, like Daryl Slayton, they didn't have those options, those primo schools, and it's time to start actually going toe-to-toe and winning battles, because you can't just like you can't run around blocks as defensive lineman, you can't run around other schools in recruiting. And then the third thing is they got to start taking back the state. Right now, it's very early. It's very, very early, and I'm not making a summary judgment on this, but there are 6 schools that have committed prospects ranked above those that Florida has in the state of Florida right now. Miami, FSU, Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, and Auburn have commitments that are higher ranked than anything Florida's got for this 2018 class. They got to start keeping their primos home and in Gainesville. It's got to change. And in case you're wondering, I did adjust for IMG. That doesn't count a single IMG kid.
Georgia's having that same problem.
End of sermon.
Yeah, and Georgia's having that same problem with their in-state guys this year too. It's a weird little thing going on right now.
Yeah, but I'd excuse that because Georgia sucks.
All right, we'll wrap up here soon with Blake. Blake, what about this 2019 start for these guys? A little bit faster start than we're used to under Jim McElwain and this staff. And is it these new guys? Is it these new hires that they made that kind of contribute to this fast start, or is it a little bit more than that? Did they change anything?
I think that it's really, this is the class that Florida's, there's more, the relationship is better. I think that the 2017 class and 2018 classes, these guys have obviously gotten to know a lot of the Florida coaches, but these guys, there's more continuity there. That these guys have all been there a long time. That they've seen enough of the offense. They've gotten to know these coaches from whenever, even before they were, in like ninth grade early, starting to pick up offers. If Florida wasn't, first or second offer, they were definitely, one of the first, 5 offers to them. So, Florida's not really playing a lot of catch up there. I know a lot of the guys, like, look at Jaleel McRae, Jaquays, let's see. Yeah, those 2 guys, Florida was their first offer. Frank Latson, I think, was one of the first couple ones. Tyreek, the same. And then obviously Dunmore is a beast. So, he's had quite a few offers before. But, I think that they're doing really well in state. These are a lot of the top guys. And like I said, I really love Dunmore's game. I think he's going to be a big time player for them. So, I think that they can definitely continue to build off of this. They have a lot of steam there. And, the 2019 kids are, they're loving a lot of the coaches. Sider's doing a lot of good things down there for them. I think Davis is going to give him a chance to get to know a lot of these other guys. Tim Skipper, a lot of kids love him. And, Rump is doing very well in Tampa recruiting for the Gators too. So, I think that, these are all areas that have been friendly to Florida in the past, and there's obviously some talent there. And I think this 2019 class, like I said earlier in the show, I think that they can be really well if Florida really capitalizes on this season.
Yeah, I for one am really excited about 2019 because I try to call it like I see it, and if it looks negative to me, I'm going to tell you. But this is a great start, and I'm clamoring for something tangible to say, hey, these inroads are paying dividends. These new coaches, McElwain's way is taking hold of the state, and things are making progress. This could be on the verge of that happening in the Florida for 2019. Florida's got 5 commitments, 100% blue chip percentage. That's not going to hold that way because nobody has that. But that's a great start.
All 4 stars right now.
What you want to see by now? What's that?
Yeah, all 4 stars right now, right?
Yes, all 4 stars.
Yeah, they're all
nationally ranked players too. They're all national by 24/7. They're all top 247 guys.
Yeah, that's what I meant that too. I did notice that when I was looking at it and completely forgot that. Yeah, so yeah, really good start.
Yeah, the thing is, like you said, right now they've got. No, I have this figure. It's not adjusted for IMG. They've got 5 of the top 40 in Florida committed for 2019. Well, that matches their best of any class since McElwain's been here, and it's over a year away. So, if they don't add another one in that particular metric, they've already maxed out to their potential. But certainly, if they hold on to those guys, there will be others. The one thing I will caution people on, and I want to kind of bring that class down a little bit and bring the 2018 up because it's just so early. The best thing you can compare this to is like election night when like those first returns come in from the precincts and they're like with 2% of the precincts reporting, Ron Paul is winning 80% to 15%, and the president, things are going to change. This is a roller coaster ride every year. And when you talk about 2 classes out, it's even more so. McElwain's still got a lot to prove. But I do think that people that are pointing to 2019 have legitimate reason to be optimistic. I'm optimistic about it. Just to offer a few stats on that. Right now, like I said, there's 100% blue chip percentage, whereas 2018 is all the way down at 33%, which is the lowest since 24% in 2015. We mentioned the Florida top 40. Right now the highest ranked player in the 2018 class is 197th. Which is not good for a top-rated player in your class, but they've already got the 44th best, and I believe it's Jaleel McRae for 2019. Yes. So we've got some numbers here that are, showing some huge swings, but all indications are this will even out somewhat as it goes forward, and I think hopefully we're starting to see some more improvement.
I definitely think that, the thing above all is that, even at this point, like you said, it's not over until they sign on the dotted line, all that, but it does give hope. It does show that that kids are buying into what Florida's selling.
Yeah, and you know what? The 2018 numbers, like Alabama doesn't have like a couple of commits right now, so you just can't be upset at, and worried in April. However, that 2019 thing, like you said, it gives people a reason to believe, and if they can just kind of grab a foothold of momentum, maybe they can be that next year's Miami to have that early traction and to get off to the races and build a special class.
Sure, can't do anything but make a positive for them. So.
Very true. Very true. Bill, you had anything else you want to talk about? But before Blake, we'll probably go ahead and let you go. But if Bill, you don't have anything else, we can just sign off on this show.
No, buddy, that's good, man. We'll have
Yeah.
much more to cover next week. We got some. I think the NFL draft is coming up, unless I'm wrong.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I got some special statistical analysis I'm working on.
Going back to the lab, gonna do another sermon or two.
Yeah, well, after I meet with Mac, yeah, we're going to talk about it.
You guys need to get an organ for the next show.
That's all right, man.
All right, this has been episode 60 of Gators Breakdown, where we really dove into the quarterbacks for class of 18 and talking recruiting with 24/7's Blake Alderman. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Bill, let them know where they can find you.
At Real B Sykes.
And Blake, you as well, please.
At Blake_Alderman.
All right, and of course, go to GatorBait, 24/7 for all your Gator website needs there with Blake, Thomas, Luke, and Marty. Those guys really got it going there.
We like to think so.
All right, so thanks, guys, for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.